Okay. So the way that Illustrator works is that you're going to have these tabs. So any open file that you have are going to have the tabs up above that you can work from. At the very top, you have the basic, just like in everything, a global system of drop downs that will allow you to develop and access basically all of the different modifiers for any action. So under File, some of the things that will be helpful is open recent files, which will show your recent files. Save as and save a copy, those are nice options to have. And then export, that's the other one that's going to be huge, to be able to export your project into like a JPEG or other different types, even DWGs, those type of things. And then package. Package is, when we talked about before, how when you bring in an image, it's linked in. And so what it's really only doing is bringing in an address to where it is on your hard drive. And then it's loading it from there. The great thing about that, like I mentioned before, is that when you do that, as you update that image, you don't have to go and replace it. You can just automatically relink it. And so as you're starting to develop, I recommend that you think about your boards at the very beginning, about what you're going to show and present, way before you're even done with the design, and start to craft your boards and think about what information you're going to need. Obviously, you're going to have plans, sections, elevations. You're going to have a site. You're going to know whether that site is square or rectilinear. Is it long or is it tall? And that will start to help you understand how to start to design your boards. And if you do that, and then you can also start to say, okay, well, what kind of renderings am I going to need? I'm obviously going to need kind of one big kind of money shot that shows how grand it is. So you can start to place that in there and make a placeholder for that. So you could start to name it just an empty image or a sketch that you took and name that image and start to populate your boards so that as you develop the project and you're doing a rendering and resaving over that last image, then it's automatically populating and updating your boards. So you pretty much are not scrambling at the last minute to design a board, get it together for the presentation. It's pretty much, and you're not wasting time doing drawings and doing renderings that that you're not going to use. And that happens a lot. That you'll do like these 50 different renderings and you only use 2 of them. And so if you are real focused about how you create and design how you communicate your project, then you're going to be able to do that. And using linking is important. Okay, so packaging, what that does is it creates one file. It takes all of those links for wherever they're at and puts it all together in a folder that has all of the links and your major files all right there in one place. So you can zip that and send it to your friend or your teammate or whatever, and you're not going to pop up with an error message that says that these links are broken, and then you have to go and manually find them. So it's a way of kind of keeping everything consolidated. I do by default, just in general, whenever I am creating a document, I pretty much already just create that folder, and I create another subfolder called links, and then I'm just placing those things. I'm basically doing it manually already. It's just a habit that I've gotten into, and it works really well. So the other thing is we can get into some document setup, which brings us up, and we can change the overall units from points to inches to millimeters if you want to deal with that. And some of these other art pieces that we're not going to worry about right now, but basically that's a really handy place to be able to change globally the units. It defaults into points, but you can use inches or millimeters, whatever you choose to use. I tend to go to inches at most points because I know kind of inches how big the board's going to be, and sometimes it's a little bit easier. But it seems to me like strokes for the line weights, keeping those at points seem to make the most sense to me. So it's usually a mix of those. When you get into Illustrator, you can go into Preferences, and this will bring up basically your overall kind of how you're going to interface with the software. So keyboard increments means if I have something selected and I use one of the arrow keys, how much is that going to move? 1 point, you can make it 10 points. If you hold the shift key down and use an arrow, it's going to jump like 10 points or 5 points, okay? Some sync settings. This is new to mine, so I'm not going to mess around with that. You can display how you want the anchors and when you have something selected to look. I never mess with that. I generally don't mess with this in terms of size and leading. I do mess with this, okay? So this is where you can say, okay, in general I want inches, but I still want my stroke and my type to be in points because those are kind of typical. So that's fine. Guides and grids. So you can show the grids underlying and you can choose colors and start to help that. You can also dictate, this is where if you have the smart guides where you can set up, well maybe I want 30-degree increments instead of 45. Snapping tolerance, how close do I get before something snaps to it? I generally don't mess with those either. Slices have to do with web page, so I'm not going to worry about that. Hyphenation, don't worry about that. Let's see, what are these other things? Plugins and scratch disk, that's going to be all set by default, so I wouldn't worry about messing that. You can change some of the interface, so if you want your interface to look different, you can change that there. I wouldn't mess with any of these other two pieces, but that generally is mostly just jump in there to edit grids and maybe your units. Okay, so as we go over at the top, let's go into edit. And so here is where we do the copy paste, where we can undo steps if we've screwed up. And some of the things to kind of, there's different ways that we can paste objects from one object to another. And these can be helpful. So like in Rhino, but more so in Illustrator, the layers stack upon one another. Okay, so the order in which they are shown, essentially, and even sub layers, determines what's visible. So if I have a big white filled circle and I have a smaller circle that's underneath it, if that's above it, I'm not going to see that smaller circle because it's going to be obscured, right? But if I put it underneath or behind it, then I'm going to see that piece. So pasting in front or in back of a selected item, that makes sense. Okay, so that's what that does. Pasting in place, so that means in the X and Y direction. So maybe you have a title up in this top right-hand corner and you want it to be placed back into that top right-hand corner rather than in the center of the page, then you want to use paste in place. And then when we get into artboards, which I'm going to show you to set up your diagrams onto multiple pages in just a minute, this is where you would be able to say, okay, paste that on all the artboards so that it's all together. Okay, find and replace usually is dealing with text. It works just like Microsoft Word. One of the things I want to caution you about is that if you're going to use something very texty, where text is the kind of main component, Illustrator is probably not the tool that you want to use. You want to be using InDesign, which we'll be getting into later in the semester. So just keep that in mind, that think about Illustrator more as composing kind of more visually heavy things, less text heavy things, because the tools that it has to modify and to edit text is actually pretty limited, and it can be frustrating. Editing colors we'll get into later. I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. Transparency and flattener, these are all kind of setups. Adobe Presets, now these are things that you want to look at. It comes with a set that's by default. So if you have an Illustrator and you're ready to export it as a PDF, you would just go here and select it. And you can also, I've created a couple of different presets that create PDFs based on resolution and things that I like, whether I'm doing a large or high resolution or not. But generally, if you stick with high quality or Illustrator default, you're going to be in a safe range, and then you can go in and mess around with those things and experiment to find what works best for you. Okay? And so when you're saving as PDF, then that's where that starts to come out. Don't worry about these type of things right now because those are all in much more advanced. So when we get into object, this is where we can start to create things and modify paths. So if we want to, if we have a series of objects, if we hit transform, let's create an object for instance. And now we can come up here. This is a way of getting to it. Like in every piece of software, there's probably 4 different ways or 3 different ways that you can access to move something or do something that you're looking for. You can do it from these menus or from the icons or usually something in native and keyboards. So you can move, reflect, shear, scale, and I would encourage you just to play around with those. So if we have multiple objects, we can start to bring those to front, to back. I'm going to change, so if we double click on the color, I'm just going to change this color. And then I'm going to create an ellipse this time. Double click to change the color. Okay, so now we can see where these things, and it does it in order of sequence. So it's always going to put the next thing you draw on top of the previous piece. So if we select this and we go to Object and Arrange, we can send it backward or send it to the back, and it will put it behind it. Okay, so that's how this thing works. And then we can also access that menu by right-clicking. So we can select an object and right-click on it, and we can transform, arrange, and we can bring this back to the front. And there's also keyboard shortcuts that you could look in to do that as well. Okay, so the next thing that's helpful is grouping. So if you start to create something, and I showed that to you a little bit when we created those little peoples, is that if you have multiple objects, you can select and group them. Now, group works really different here in Illustrator than it does in Rhino. If we go over to this sidebar menu over on the right, and we go down to what looks like 2 sheets of paper stacked on one another, and you hover over, it says layers. If we open that, grouping works by layers. Okay, so it assigns, basically what it's doing is assigning those 2 objects to a specific sublayer. Okay, so if you think of Illustrator as individual objects that have their own layer, so everything has its own identity, its own element, and it's arranged in a stack. Okay, and so you can go around, and so let's say that I want to put this behind. I could click and drag that piece underneath, and that changes that arrangement. Okay, so I can control everything right in here. And the way grouping works is by selecting these things as subsets. So I'm going to edit, undo, reorder, and I'm going to undo the grouping. Okay, so you can see that now each of these elements are just sub-elements underneath this layer. Okay, so let's highlight path, the one just below the main layer, and I can create a new layer. Okay, now I can drag that down, just click and hold and drag it down until the layer becomes highlighted, and you can see that that becomes a layer underneath. So it's ordered underneath the major layer. Now I can do the same kind of grouping by selecting, hold the Shift key down and select both of those layers, and I can click and hold and drag them into that layer, and now they're organized. Okay, So now, if I come over to the side over here where we can select whatever's on that layer, when I select it, it's selecting both underneath. Okay, so this is a way of organizing your geometry, organizing your elements to keep them organized. A lot of times what I try to do is think about what objects will have the same kind of stroke weight or kind of look to them, and try to group them in those those similar ways, because that way I can change the way that thing looks globally, that element, by just selecting those items on that layer. So think about organizing your project by the way these things look. That's the way I would deal with that. Okay? So that's how kind of layers work. And let's go back and select one of these guys. So there's certain things that we can do. We can lock elements. So let's say we're working on something, but it's close together, and I don't want to accidentally be selecting that element. I can just lock it. And again, you can right-click and lock it. I can hide that, which would be the same as turning off the visibility here in the layers. Okay. We're not going to get into rasterizing and stuff. Expanding is something that's actually quite interesting. For instance, let's say that I have this, and I'm going to increase this stroke to, let's say, 4 points. So it's, you guys can see that it's kind of big. What I can do when I expand it is I can kind of break it up, explode that in a way. And what it's going to do, think about it as exploding it into 2 different elements. It's a fill element, and it's also a stroke element. Okay, and you'll notice that what it did here is it created a group. And now I have 2 different things underneath that group. I have the outline, and then I have the fill. So that's a way of doing things quite interestingly. And so we can also, let's say, take a line, for instance. Just draw a line, and let's make it let's make it big, thick, like 20 points. And let's go over here to the stroke at the top and click, and let's make it dashed, for instance. Let's want that to be, change that to 20. And the gap to be, let's say, 5. Right up here to the stroke, right up there. You can also access it over here on this side, on the right sidebar menu, where it shows these lines here. Okay, you can access it either way. So if we select that guy, and we do Object Expand Appearance, so now what we see is that we have it broken down into the layers, into these sub-elements. So we've got that piece, we've got the line that's underneath it, and then we have these other pieces in between. So we can individually select these different pieces. So that's one way of breaking out the stroke. Those we're not going to get into too much detail, so don't worry about that too much. Now when we get into a path, when we start to join these, get into it, we can want to sometimes connect one line with another line and make it one continuous line. So you would get the 2 anchor points together and click Join. We can outline strokes. We can outline the path. So let's say that I have this guy, and I want to outline that stroke. You see what it does is it creates individual pieces, so that now I could maybe go in and select each of those individual pieces and modify them as objects, because otherwise it's just a mathematical, we can't actually select those individual pieces. Okay, so we could go in and modify how that stroke looks, for instance. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to. So there's lots of different things that you can do in here that relate to the paths and the shapes, creating patterns, uh, different things. And each one of these things, what I would do is just mess around with to kind of create. The next kind of piece that we do want to look at, though, is making clipping mask and compound paths. So clipping mask means that basically I am going to create a shape, and then I'm going to cut out whatever is outside of it. So I'm going to make a polygon, and I'm just going to select here, and there's my polygon. Now I'm going to go up to my selection tool. You can type V or go up to this corner, and I'm going to select everything that I want to be clipped. Okay, so I've got those things selected, and then if I go Object, Clipping Mask, and Make, you can see that what it's done is clipped it around that shape that I want it to. And that shape can be any closed shape. So if you want it really crazy amoeba-like, that can be done. Okay? And if you look over here, again, in our layers, I'm going to expand this out so you can see it's made a clipping group. So we have the clipping path, that's our polygon, and then we have these different groups. So if we select that clipping group, we can undo that by going Object, Clipping Mask, Release. Okay? So you can undo it, redo it. Okay? The other object here, which is helpful, is making a compound path. So sometimes, like in a letter A, let's say that I want, I'm going to draw a new one of these guys. Delete that. So I have this piece, and what I want is a hole in that selection. So I want a hole dug out there. So what I can do is select both of them and go Object, Compound Path, Make, and it will pull out that hole in the middle there. And again, if you go over and look at it, you can see that it's a compound path. But what it doesn't do is make it into a sublayer. Right now it's considering it one path, one element. Okay? So I can also just release that. Now there's some other tricks there. So those are the major pieces that we can get into with artboards, or with the objects. If we go into type, I'm not going to get into that right now. That's pretty simple to look at. But there is some things, powerful tools over here in the select category. So we can select objects above or below kind of incrementally. But what I find is really powerful is being able to select things that have the same appearance or the same line weights or the same color. If you're trying to organize your drawings into layers that you can control by how they appear, you can select them by choosing both. So let's deselect this guy, and I'm going to select these by the same fill color. And now they're selected by the same fill color. Okay, so that can be very helpful. Effects we went into and looked at a little bit when we got into the drop shadow. There's other ones in here that you can play with. Some of them are quite interesting. So if we select that rectangle, for instance, and we go to distort and transform, we can do like maybe pucker and bloat, for instance. And again, you have to click preview to see what's going on. But as you adjust these things, you can see how it's modifying the geometry. And again, if we modify that geometry like I showed in the video, if we come over to appearance, it's showing that, okay, as an item that we can come back and click on and modify in a stack. So that's one thing that's nice about it. Alright, so I'm not going to go too much into that. There's very limited things that you can do to raster images. There are some of these Photoshop effects that are here, but generally if you're trying to take a raster image, raster being made up of pixels versus being vectors made up of points and lines in mathematics, they operate very differently. Resolution matters very much when you're talking about pixels. When we're doing vector work in Illustrator or Rhino, it doesn't matter what the resolution is because we can make it whatever size we want, and it's not gonna. It's independent of that. Okay, views are generally you don't mess with too much, other than sometimes I'll go in and hide edges or show rulers, or I generally turn on show rulers a lot so that we can see the rulers up above. But other than that, there's not too much that you can get into. You can show some grids. But once you show the rulers, let's talk about, you can create guides. And guides can also be associated with whatever layer you're on. So if I have layer 2 selected, it's going to start putting guides on layer 2. So kind of a good role of practice is to just create a new layer, double click and call it guides. And whenever you put a guide, just make sure that one's selected so you can turn off the guides easily. And the way you create guides is just going up to the ruler that you want, clicking and dragging down. Same thing over here. Click and drag over. And these are ways of really creating, nice ways of creating alignments between and starting to compose and create grids for your project, keeping everything kind of straight and consistent. And that becomes really important when you're doing a presentation, making sure, because if we're going through the different slides, you know, sometimes if it's not aligned, it's going to move up and down and look kind of unprofessional. So that's one way of using guides, which really help. If we go over to window, now window is going to be important, and you'll use this quite a bit. So window basically is whatever kind of these tasks that are going to be on the right side over here. These are all the major tools. Okay, so right now we can see that layers are turned on, so we can look at layers, we can look at transform libraries. But there's other things that we can do, like appearance is shown up, and we can bring those up as a separate kind of, here's transform, right? And but if there's something that we're missing that you want to see, like if I wanted to change, if I wanted to look at the links, the images that are kind of linked in, I could look at that and open that up, and I could see what that is, close it down. I could drag it over and dock it as part of one of these pieces. And so that becomes part of my permanent tool set if I want to. One thing that I want to show, so that's basically what happens in the windows. So over here on the left-hand side, well, let's go to the top right now. So anytime you select, this is going to be the major information and modification tool. So you'll notice that anytime I select an object, basically I can modify almost everything about that object right at this panel here. Okay, I can change its stroke, what type of profile it has, its opacity, what kind of style that might be applied to it. I can transform by clicking on here. I can say, okay, I want it to be in a particular, I want it at 6 inches versus 6.5, or no, I want it at 8, X and Y. I can change the size of the thing. I can change its rotation, how much it skews. So you got all of those different patterns right up here, which is powerful. Over on this side is basically your selection, your kind of main actions that you want to perform. Direct, we covered these, the direct selection versus the sub-selection. Magic wand, I don't mess with those too much. I almost never use those. The pen tool, we talked about how to create the lines, so you should be familiar with that. Text, creating text, you can explore that yourself. Same thing with paintbrushes. I don't use those or these two very much. Nor erase. But basically these types of things in here, scale, rotate, those can be really handy. The other thing that you'll use quite a bit is this Artboard tool. So let's go down here and look at Artboard. When you click up Artboard, what that does is it allows you to change the dimensions of your page. So let's say that I want, it's preset at legal, but if I wanted to switch it to tabloid, for instance, I can just do that right here. And you can drag it so you can make customized sheet sizes. So that, and you can rename the artboards. Okay. Let's see, then we've got the fill color, which we've talked about. And then there's some modifications. So you can take away a fill by clicking down here, or we can apply a gradient to the fill by putting there, or a solid color. So these are your options in terms of fill. Okay, then the other things are how we want to view the screen modes. Let's not mess with them and confuse you right now on that. So you can explore that yourself, but I'm not going to confuse you. Okay, so the next kind of piece that we want to look at is over here on the right hand side. These are different colors, color guides, and cooler. Cooler's kind of neat. You have to have it connected to the web, but what that is a site on Adobe that allows you to choose your different colors. You can build up swatches. So when you determine the colors that you're going to use, you can save those colors so you can always reuse them. That's what the swatch tab is for. Brushes are interesting because they can change the way your object looks. So I have this line here, and right now it's set up as fill, but maybe I want it to look kind of chalky, charcoal, as a stroke. You can see that that changed into this kind of chalky. If I select it again and I want to make it look like that. And you can create your own strokes, and there's also libraries of different brushes that you can choose from right down here at the bottom. My recommendation, be very hesitant about using these things for this. I mean, because a lot of these things are kind of goofy and can make it look unprofessional really quickly. So be very careful about using them. I almost never use them. You can get into symbols. We'll get into that a little bit later. Your strokes, so anything that you have in terms of stroke can be modified here. Sometimes in these panels, if you go over to this top corner right here, you can select that and show options. Then that will give you more options that are available. So by default, sometimes you're not seeing all of the things that you can do. So if you think that there should be something there, go over into that top corner and pick it and check it out. So we've shown transparency, so you've played with that a little bit. The links, appearance is, we've looked at that. This is basically anytime you have something selected, it's going to show you a stack of what's made and what's created. Now, there's certain things that you can do. So let's say that in diagrams you're creating a certain type of line or a certain type of arrow that you want to use over and over and over again. You can select that and create that by clicking this new, and now anytime you have something that you want to apply that style to, you can just click on that or click up here and select it as a style, and that's going to change its appearance automatically. Layers. Layers is probably your most important piece because you're going to be able to see these and group these. You double click on them, you can change the name. If you double click over here off of the name, then you can bring up and change the color that they show up in the screen, whether they're locked or not. Generally, I don't mess around with them too much other than maybe changing their colors and their name. Down here, if you have anything selected, you can delete it by clicking the trash can. It's going to warn you if it has artwork on there. So it just deleted all of our guides. But you can also create a new layer by also right next to it. And you can also create sub-layers. So if I want to layer underneath those things, I can create those sublayers there. And then the next piece that we're going to get into is artboards. Okay. So we can see when we zoom out that we have one kind of board. Well, if we want, we can add another board. So we can go down to the bottom once we're clicked on Artboards, and we can say New Artboard. So that gives us a new page in which we can start to put our geometry. So one of the things that you want to do that can be kind of confusing is that it doesn't necessarily change your layering. So the way that I try to make these things work for me is that I might have certain layers that are associated with artboards. So for instance, I would call this Artboard 2. And then anything that's on that artboard, I would start putting it underneath that piece, because the layers are kind of agnostic about where the artboards are setting. So you want to make sure that you look at that and keep your layer organized. A lot of this digital work that we're doing is about organization. If you keep yourself organized, your life is going to be easier. If you're messy, it's going to be really difficult for you. Okay, and that means files, it means layers. Just if you do it and set up a structure and work within that framework, you're going to be much happier people. Okay, you're going to have a much easier time. So what I want you to do is, using this artboard and using these layers, I want you to create however many artboards that you need to start to lay out your project. Okay, I want you to set up and think about it in terms of a presentation. Okay, how would you, if I'm going to do a PowerPoint, you guys are going to give me a PowerPoint presentation using this, but we're not using PowerPoint, we're going to use Illustrator, and lay out your diagrams on these different artboards, organize them based on the layer concepts that we've talked about, and just set up however many artboards you need to show your concepts and your diagrams. Yeah, you can, if you go to Artboard, Rearrange Artboards, so that's clicking in this top little corner here, then you can choose how you want to set, how many columns you want, how you want to do it. I generally do it just horizontal and just keep scrolling over, and I just find it kind of easy. If you go over here to double click, if you double click on an artboard, it'll automatically kind of zoom to that artboard. Okay? So, questions about that? That's the rough kind of overview of where these things are at and how you do it. The main thing that you have to do is just jump in and start creating these things. So a lot of these can be just very simple things like taking that topography like we did and just adding arrows and annotation, using your pen tool to create whatever kind of annotation you're going to create. And then once that's done and selected, going over here to stroke and adjusting the strokes, adding arrowheads if needed, any kind of dash. And again, a lot of these things that are going to come out as default, you're going to have to modify. So I want you to really think about how these things look and communicate. These are artistic compositions. You want to be very clear, very simple, very focused on the topic that you're trying to diagram. Don't get overboard. Don't try to be super fancy. Let's first work on clarity, and then we can amp up the juice a little bit in terms of how these things look. And I think the last kind of diagram is working in Rhino and bringing and importing. That's also really helpful. Oh, there's one other thing I want to show you that can be really helpful. Let's say we create an object. Let's see, any notes. Okay, this is one of the reasons why I like to pretty much produce all of the line work and stuff in in Rhino because the tools are really good. So let's say I want to make this kind of, what I want to do is I want to create this rectangle shape, but I want that corner cut out. In Illustrator, it's pretty easy. I can just come in here and I can trim, you know, just select both of them and trim away the stuff that I don't want. Well, here, I could come over here and then use this knife tool or slice tool, or where is it? It's over here. So I don't even know where it is because I hate to use it. There we go. To the right. Scissors. There he is, by the Illustrator. So scissors. So I could come over here and I could get it on this intersection, and I have to get it just right. It's not very precise, and then I could cut these things. There is one thing that you can do. If we go up to our window and we look at Pathfinder, and we open up Pathfinder, there are these Boolean modes. So I could take these two and say that I want to minus the front, and then it'll automatically create that. So now it's being treated as a compound path. So this is a way of making compound paths through this Pathfinder. So let's undo that. Let's say I wanted to add that shape. I could do that. So this is another way, if you want to stay in Illustrator and work, you can use this Pathfinder. That's really quite helpful. Okay? So that's about all we have time for today. We'll get those links up to you and get everyone the Dropbox link so you have access. I'll put up some examples and then post this thing up onto YouTube as well quickly. Yes? We will probably do both. Yep. Okay.